quite desert island discs, but the idea is that you get to know this woman who's incredible a little bit better. And if you can't hear any time, just put up your hand and so we can get the mics fixed. This is being filmed as well, so that those people who couldn't be here today get a chance to see this conversation as well. So firstly, Alice, can I ask you, what attracted you to be Abertay's Chancellor?
Well, I certainly never expected to be asked to be Chancellor. Like a lot of things in my life, some people have approached me about various things. So it was a huge surprise and an extreme honour when I was approached and asked would I consider being Chancellor of this university. So that's how it happened.
What does the Chancellor do?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's certainly a question that I asked. What would you expect me to do? And I think officially the role is to be the titular head of the university, conferring degrees and other honorary awards. But I wouldn't have been interested in just that, though that's a very important role. And I think more generally, Chancellor is expected to be a friend to the university, to be an ambassador for its ambitions and all the things that it wants to do, hopefully be a source of some inspiration and support for staff and for students, to give advice when necessary perhaps to the court, to the leadership of the university, but generally have a presence in the university and be part of what you're trying to do and achieve here.
Okay. So what impact do you want to make in the next few years that you're here with us? Or 10 years or so?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. And I think in the number of things I've done, I've always tried, not always as successfully as I would hope, to make a difference and to make a positive contribution and impact. But I clearly will be doing that alongside and with the leadership here, staff in general, and the students. So I see it as a community approach. But also I'm keen to hear from staff and students what they would expect a Chancellor to do and to achieve in their term of office. So I want to learn as much as to contribute.
That's excellent. So we've got some questions that were submitted through our Eventbrite, and I'm going to take one of the first questions, which was from Lauren Smith. Having launched Abertay's new strategic plan early this year, can you tell us what you're most excited about and what you think the biggest challenge will be in relation to putting this plan into action?
Well, one of the things that struck me in terms of strategic plan, of course, I came in at a time when it was being developed and naturally was quite far down the road. But one of the things I was very excited about was, in fact, it embodies a lot of the principles and values and purpose that I think are crucial for a good modern university, but also one in which staff and students can develop their careers and their ambitions. And so that whole approach to making the university open and accessible to people who can really benefit from coming to university is very important. But also to be a place where people want to work, enjoy working, where the students feel that they're learning a lot from the staff, and also a university that's very much a university within its community and is adding something to the broader community that is Dundee, that is Scotland, that is wider than that. And added to that, the international perspective as well. So very attracted by the fact the number of students that come from different parts of the world and staff, and the connections the university will have in that wider university and higher education network. So looking at the strategic plan, for me it embodies a lot of that, but it's very forward-looking. It links what I would say are very important, a lot of the theory and the learning and research, very much linked to practice and solving very practical problems that face society. And that's very much in the roots of the society, of the university, which I think are very important. So the whole digital strategy, for example, the whole approach to learning and enhancement and how these all interconnect, transforming lives but transforming the community. So I'm excited to be part of that. So challenges, well, like any other area, a lot of what's there and looking forward rather than backwards involves quite a lot of change and adapting, different ways of doing things, being open to different ways of doing things and flexible. And that's not always easy because you've got to not abandon things that you've done before, and certainly not things that are fundamental to good practice, but actually be prepared and open. I mean, we are a learning institution after all, so therefore I feel people working within it should also embody that kind of approach to their lives. So it will be a challenge because, and some of these challenges are unknown at the moment, but it's being confident and flexible enough to deal with the challenges that come.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go back now into your background. So you're known as being a leader in widening access in Scotland. Your biography notes that you left school at 15. You went on to get your hires at Stevenson College as a part-time student, as Nigel said, in your 30s. So what made you leave school early? You're clearly a very bright woman. So what made you leave school early?
Well, you have to remember, I'm ancient, you see, so I'm in my 70s. So when I was 15, that was, about 60 years ago. And then there was quite a different attitude, particularly to the role of women in society. And I can't overestimate how much that was. And so it wasn't really expected that women would have, in general, careers. I went to a school in Edinburgh that was selected on the basis of IQ. That didn't really mean very much to me at that time. I didn't appreciate the significance of that. And therefore, there was probably a higher proportion of people who did stay on to do hires. But that particular session, they had introduced the O Grace, which meant that you could leave in your 4th year. And I was only 15. And I was desperate to earn money, to be out and to be independent and do things for myself. So to some extent, I felt that I didn't need to go on and do hires because I could get a very good job without them. And so off I went, didn't tell my parents, and went off and was interviewed for a job at the West End in Edinburgh as a shorthand typist, and had learned the skills of shorthand and typing, and I started work. So there was other bits of the question that I've forgotten, but that was the beginning. So I suppose, how did I then change was part of it, was it?
No, what I'm going to ask you is one of the questions from the audience, which was about a shorthand typist. It's a question from Anne Kenny. Your bio says you started life as a shorthand typist. I'm interested to know whether from school this is the sort of career path that was chosen for females.
Yes, very much so. And it's interesting, when we did our first widening access course at Edinburgh in the mid-1980s, predominantly the women that returned to study were either secretaries, stroke shorthand typists, or nurses, because these were more traditional roles that women should fulfill. I should tell you that the insurance company that I worked for was very small, and we were taken over by a big firm, and they were also based in the West End of Edinburgh. And they had different rules in this big firm. And one rule that I soon found out was that if you got engaged to be married, you had to leave work because they didn't employ married women. So there we were in the so-called swinging 60s, 1964, I got engaged and therefore had to find a new job. And one of the other rules, and it's funny to think of the insurance industry now, so many women in it, but all the women in there were either secretaries, shorthand typists, or clerkesses. And we were required to wear brown nylon overalls, buttoned from below the neck to below the knee. And the official reason was we had to wear these, otherwise we'd distract the men from their work. So this is the context you've got to remember, that people accepted these things, and yes. And it was there but when I moved from there, actually they did me a favour, because I then went to work for a small firm again of surveyors. And I worked for a guy who was very able and who encouraged me to run the organisation, do things, so I was able to do that. And I learned a lot from him and the other people there. And I think so and it has been men in my career that have supported me to do other things, because there were so few women in senior jobs to be there to support. And he said, oh, why don't you go back and do some hires, and you could be a surveyor because you know the business. And so I went back and did some hires, and then other people said, you've done well in your hires, why are you going to be a surveyor? Why don't you go to university? And I should say that my husband had gone back in his 20s to university when our children were very young, and I used to type all his essays. And then he started getting me to type his friends' essays, and then I typed PhD theses to earn a bit of extra money. And my husband's theory is, once I read them, I thought, I could do this as well. But he was a big support in the sense that he had he'd gone first. So therefore it wasn't quite so frightening for me to go in my 30s. I was 37 before I got my first degree. And when we set up the Access course, one of the biggest barriers, I think, to people coming to university is actually just going into that building. The whole culture and atmosphere is so different. So we set up a particular kind of Access course with a further education college. And it was jointly taught, it was quite unique, by staff at university, staff in the college. It was taught in the university so that mature students could get used to going to the library, going into lecture theatres. And so it wasn't such a big barrier when they then came to university themselves, because they'd overcome that barrier. So that was quite a unique programme. And one of the unintended things was some of the college lecturers who taught on the course then decided to do PhDs in university. So it was how these things can just have a plus for everyone involved.
So you went back and got your Highers, then went on to Edinburgh University to get your degree in economics and politics. You got it first. You then got a scholarship to fund a PhD.
Yes.
You then got a job teaching economics and politics. So were you always planning to be a teacher?
I've never planned anything in my life, so I should admit that straight up. You know, people say, what advice will you give me in my career? And I'm thinking, oh dear. Because I think it's more about opportunities arising and being prepared to have a go, to take risks. And think, that's interesting. I'll have a go at that. I have to say, my first day at university, I came home and said to my husband, I'm not going back. It's awful. It's full of very young people and much more intelligent than me. So I obviously went back and kind of got over that. So I've had a totally unplanned career. I got a better first degree than I expected. So people who then expected me to do a PhD. And as you say, I got a scholarship. And you learn a lot in different roles, and my PhD was on ACAS, the Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Service, in the days when we used to talk about industrial relations, and there was actually quite a lot of big profile strikes, and the big miners' strike of the 1980s was on, and I was working on the ACAS during that, and it was fascinating because you learned so much just watching people trying to resolve disputes. But I only did that, I was only doing that for 1 year, and then I started teaching as well. So I was trying to do my PhD and do my first academic job. But even then, I still wasn't thinking, will I definitely be an academic? Because I chose economics and politics because I thought, well, I really wanted to choose history actually, but my husband had done history, so we decided that it wouldn't be a good idea for the two of us to do the same thing. And I thought, well, I need to get a job afterwards, so I'll do business studies and economics. And then I found business studies, while interesting, I'd been there, I'd been in business, I wanted to learn something new. Politics had been the outside subject, that became the passion. But I thought I better hold on to economics because I might need a real job somewhere along the line. And so it just kind of happened. And then at the University of Edinburgh, I was very lucky and very privileged to be promoted, but also to get the chance to play, having different roles. So it's a big institution, and therefore, obviously the vice principal role gave me a real insight into how universities are run. And I also headed up something called the Institute of Governance with my colleague David McCrone. And at that time, Scotland was like a political laboratory because people were excited about the potential of a new parliament. We were being asked all the time for advice on electoral systems, things that I know most real people find exceptionally boring, but if you're a political scientist, you find fascinating. Things like what size should the parliament be, what should be the gender balance, what's the electoral system, what's the checks and balances. And of course, it was such interest to people all over the world. And through that process, we were learning from best practice in different countries and so on. And as academics, very real way of inputting to what was going on in the country and what was happening more generally. So it was great for students because students could see right away the connection between the theory that they were learning and the practice of what was actually happening day to day in Scotland. So it felt like being in a political laboratory as people were excited about planning. I mean, it's very rare in a country's history you get to create a new political institution like a parliament without it being a really, tough time and literally blood on the streets. And that didn't happen in Scotland, thank goodness. And it was a positive and constructive approach to creating a new institution.
I'm actually going to talk about your campaigning, actually. You've been an active campaigner all of your life. You campaigned for the Scottish Parliament, and you've campaigned for equal representation of women through various groups. So what's inspired you to campaign?
I think, first of all, on the gender issue, I come from a family of very strong women, not educated women, but strong women in the sense of running the household, running affairs, and bossy women, actually. Particularly, I think of my Auntie Bessie. No one would cross my Auntie Bessie. So I was used to, it didn't ever occur to me as a young girl, and even as a relatively young woman, that I'd be discriminated against. And even when I was in an insurance company and they had those silly rules about not employing married women and so on, I just thought, that's just silly, And it was only when I saw systematically how saw lots of women not being able to achieve the things they should be able to achieve because they had the merit and the skills and the quality to be able to achieve them. So you started to see systems, the way that systems excluded people. One of the classic areas is how few women there were in politics. And so if you ask the question, why so few women in politics or public life generally, people would say, well, women don't come forward. Therefore, women's fault. But the challenge to that, if you're a social scientist, is to ask the question, why? Why don't they come forward? And as soon as you start unpacking the why, and you look at the barriers that women faced, then you start to understand, well, why would you come forward if you're just going to be rejected anyway? So unless you ask the why question, you don't ever reach the solutions to that. So yes, that was an interesting time. So the campaign was very much built on this is a loss of potential, not only of the individuals, but clearly to Scottish society more generally, that we didn't have a much more balanced men, female and women active in political life, active in public life, active in industry, active in our universities, because for me, that would benefit not only the women and their children, but the men as well. I saw it's not something excluding men, but actually, and as I've said, I wouldn't have gone on to do some of the roles that I had done if I hadn't been supported by men as well. So the campaign is and we did this quite effectively through actually producing the evidence. So a group of us, in addition to other things we were doing in our lives, we created something called the Gender Audit in Scotland, because we were making the case for better representation and so on. And every year we produced something that just said, women in business, women in politics, women in universities. We had a whole categories, law, medicine, and we just let the figures speak for themselves. And each year we produced had there been any change, etc. And we used that as a campaigning tool in an organisation called Engender, which still exists today, I'm pleased to say, and has got much better funding than we had. We were all doing it on a voluntary basis. And as part of creating a new parliament, we argued that this new house should be a house that's accessible to men and women for the benefit of public policy and delivery and so on. Now, whether it's achieved all of these things, of course, is a completely other debatable point. But the aspiration was you needed to start on that much more equal basis, and that needed a concerted campaign. And it was cross-party, it involved women and men, and it involved people who were not in political parties as well, women in the churches, trade unions, business, and so on, because the objective was very, very clear. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make quite a significant change. So a very proud moment for me was the day that the Parliament did open its doors, not in its current building, but it was on the top of the mound in Edinburgh, and seeing just so many women walking through that door for the first time. So like a lot of things, it didn't happen by accident. It happened by the campaigning of lots of women so that other women could take their place.
That's fantastic. And actually, on a personal level, I've got a question from an audience member, from Louise Jack. When faced with challenges, and that was obviously one of the significant challenges, what tips do you have for overcoming inner doubts?
It can be hard, because I think one of the things I certainly say to students is that in life you'll get a lot of disappointments and you will get setbacks, and clearly lots of challenging things might happen to you. But it's what you learn, I think, and building resilience. And not expecting that everything that will necessarily be smooth and easy in life, because it isn't like that, actually. And it's how you respond and react to challenges that's important, and try and build your confidence so that you're better able when the next setback or challenge comes along. And trying to obviously reflect a bit about the lessons you might learn to avoid something that could maybe have been avoided or not happening again. It's not always easy.
Sage advice.
It's not always easy.
I'm actually going to talk about you being a female role model, which you very much are. You've achieved an incredible amount as a woman. You were the first woman at Edinburgh University to be the head of Department of Politics, the first female vice principal at Edinburgh University, the first female chair of the Scottish Funding Council, the first female general secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's a lot of firsts. So what advice would you give women who might be facing the glass ceiling, or who might feel they face discrimination because of either gender or age or some kind of bias? How do you overcome that?
Well, I've given examples of some overt discrimination that I've experienced, and there's others I wouldn't want to broadcast. But I do think things have improved, but I don't think they've improved sufficiently. I think there's still quite a lot work to be done there. And in terms of advice, in anything you do, and I would apply this to any role, it's not just about if you're in a leadership role, whatever role you play, I think one wants to make a difference, and that it involves hard work in working life. It also application, consideration of others as well, but also it might involve taking risks when you have to, and actually getting out of your comfort zone sometimes, because I think most of the research does demonstrate that women are less inclined to put themselves outside their comfort zone. They feel they have to be more competent before applying for things than, say, their male counterparts, according to the research, and therefore take some risks. But also I think it's important to learn by supporting other people, especially to remember to and to take advice from people that are willing to give it, and remember to say thank you for that as well. But through other networks and support of other women and men, to be able to then overcome some of the barriers that you might face. But the other thing I would say is a career isn't everything, and I think one of the things I've tried to do, not always successfully I have to say, is to have other things and interests in my life, so that it's not just about work. I'm always committed and motivated to do the best job I can, but that's not all that's important in life. So it's remembering that it's good to have a rounded life. It's hard, I know, and I certainly know some of the hours I put in trying to finish an article or whatever that needed to be in for publication, or read more papers and halfway through the night for a meeting the next day. And so certain jobs can, and certainly in current society, they're very demanding, hours-wise. But I think it's to try and get a balance in life as well.
That segues nicely into your role in public life, because you've played a very active role in public life. You've sat on a great number of boards, or chaired a number of boards. You've chaired the Scottish Funding Council for 4 years, so our key funder. You were the first Scottish Public Service Ombudsman, and investigating final complaints for NHS trusts and universities and colleges and councils. And you were the first, you're a fellow of the RSE, so you're General Secretary of the RSE, sorry. You've actually had a very full public life in addition to a very full career life. What do these roles teach you?
Huge amount, actually, because quite often when you're doing a job, you don't actually realise how much you're learning until you're in maybe another situation. You think, I saw that. So I mentioned earlier that working on ACAS for my research and watching the guys, and it was men who were resolving disputes through mediation mainly, and then later arbitration, and watching how they brought different sides together, people with totally opposing views, and how they managed to narrow the gap. And boy, have I needed that when I've been in management positions of running various things. So I learned a lot from that. I learned a huge amount when I was on the Nolan Committee, Standards in Public Life. Fascinating to be on something like that. To be on a UK body, you get a different perspective of what's going on in Scotland from looking at it from a different perspective. Though I always felt I was a bit of the Scottish novelty. It was Lord Neil that came after Lord Nolan, and you could never quite get my Scottish accent. I could see him peering at me. What is she saying now? So learned a lot in that role. Certainly learned a lot working through the university and the Funding Council in terms of, higher education, further education, and so on. I think one of my biggest learning roles was as Ombudsman, because there you were dealing with every aspect of people's lives, because the Ombudsman's role in Scotland covers virtually everything that the state pays for. And some of the most difficult cases clearly were to do with things that had gone wrong in the National Health Service. I mean, for all the wonderful things that happen in NHS, things don't always turn out well. And particularly dealing with parents of children who died and trying to get explanations about what had gone on. Because when things go wrong, the natural instinct of people is to close up and not say anything. And also they're frightened of litigation. So for parents trying to get, well, what on earth happened that my son died on the operating theatre, and no one would talk to them, trying to open that up and at least get an explanation. And one of the biggest things was learning how important good communication is, because a lot of complaints start from people not listening and people not hearing or respecting the other point of view. And therefore the thing builds up and can get out of proportion. But it's that being open and listening and actually thinking, well, what did go wrong here, and what can we learn so that it doesn't happen to someone else? So and one of the biggest things that I found tricky was to get people to say sorry. I remember having a headline that was like Elton John, sorry is the hardest word. Because the number of public servants that wouldn't say sorry, because again, the fear of litigation. And I pressed very, very hard, and finally, after I'd left office, but it finally happened, that legislation went through the Scottish Parliament to allow people to say sorry without that in itself being admittance of liability, because things do go wrong in life. People don't intentionally want to kill someone on the operating theatre, but things can go wrong. And for most people that come to an ombudsman, they don't want money. They want to understand what went wrong, and they want an apology, and they want to make sure it didn't happen to someone else. So I think for me, these were very good lessons of life that apply more generally, and that you should apply in terms of your day-to-day dealings with other people.
And you can see the link there with ACAS, with your early research,
yes.
your PhD research in conciliation, mediation, actually taking that further into your career, and much later, actually, same skills, communication, mediation, and as you say, respect for others. I'm going to take another question from the floor, which we had submitted earlier, which was from Lorna Edwards. You've appeared to have made lots of leaps of faith during your career. What was most difficult, and what was the scariest from a personal point of view?
Gosh, that's a very good question. And I suppose there's a number of stages where, while I've had an unplanned career, I've also had a non-traditional career, because I suppose having gone into university, people would have expected that I would have stayed in the sector. So coming out and going for the Ombudsman's role probably was quite a perverse thing to do, actually. So that was quite a big leap. What was the biggest one? Yeah. It's quite hard for me to answer that and reflect back. I've always, I suppose because it was unplanned and it was non-traditional, I wasn't frightened about trying something else. because I always feel I could work at something. You know, I was a good waitress at the age of 15 working in cafes and so on, and I wouldn't be frightened to do, you know, anything that I needed to do in terms of, you know, well, there's obviously a limit to that, but you know what I mean. So I was never worried about the status of a job necessarily, and most things that I've ended up doing, people have said, have you heard about such and such? Why don't you apply? So I've not actively sought other things, but sometimes it's involved quite a big jump. And then, of course, you have the, oh my goodness, can I actually do it? Once you get something, that's always that challenge as well. But I've always felt that hopefully things I've done, I've been able to contribute something, but I've always wanted to do things where I was learning something new as well. One of the attractions of being Chancellor.
Learn something new every day. I've got a couple other questions. These both come from Mary Thurston. I think they're both very good questions. How do you maintain a work-life balance?
It's been difficult at times, I would not deny that. And I suppose there's times where I've thought, actually, I got the balance wrong. You know, for all I've said, one tries to get a rounded life. There are times where I've thought, I should have been somewhere else. So I don't think it's easy. And still, I think it's particularly difficult, apologies to the men here, but I think it's still particularly difficult for women. And whether we like it or not, I think we still carry more of the guilt about not being somewhere. Than perhaps, and I'm generalising here because I know that doesn't apply to everybody. So it's not always been easy, but I think being conscious of it and doing what you can, and remember, you can't be perfect. I remember saying to I've got two daughters, both very old now.
They're not old, they're my contemporaries. They're not old at all.
They're not old at all. But old in terms of, how can I have a daughter that age? But I've always said to them, you know, when oh, Mum, why did you do this or why did you do that? And I think at the end of the day as a parent, I said, I did the best I could. And that's all you can really ask, that you care and you do the best that you can. And I don't pretend to be perfect.
And Mary's second question was, what one piece of advice would you give aspiring female leaders?
Go for it.
There we go. Good question. So my last question, my last formal question is, you're a woman of many achievements. You have a CBE. You have 8 honorary degrees. Not one from Abertay yet, I have to say, yet. You're a fellow of various esteemed organisations, including the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Academy of Social Sciences, the Royal College of Surgeons. Don't know how you got that one. Royal Society of
Physicians.
Arts.
There's a big squabble between physicians and surgeons.
Royal Society of Arts. You're Emeritus Professor of Politics at Edinburgh University, and a trained ballet dancer, which you still dance today.
Yes.
What are you most proud of?
I don't think there's one individual thing. I mean, I think there's different things in different stages. I think I'm proud that I did make the career break and go back and get a degree when I had young children and dealt with. I remember first year exams, 1st December, and both children had chicken pox. You know, wonderful. It's the same week of the exams, so you didn't sleep and whatever, and translate exams. So having done that was a great sense of achievement. I mean, I remember my father saying to my husband, what's she giving up a good job as a secretary for, to go back and read books? And, you know, because to him, I had a good job. Why on earth would I give that up and go and read books? So I was proud to have done that. I was proud of what I achieved at the university in terms of promotion, but also I think I was most proud of launching the first access course because it wasn't easy. The admissions deans at the time said, oh no, we couldn't possibly have an access course, our standards will drop. So myself and another colleague went into all the archives and we looked at all the records, and and this is where evidence is so important. We were able to demonstrate through the evidence that actually people who had returned not through access courses because it was higher than my day, had actually outperformed the conventional students who came back, and particularly the women did better. Now they hit other barriers when they hit the labour market, but that's another question. So I think I was very proud of achieving that. I think a lot of the things through the Funding Council, I mean, there's an organisation that some of you will be familiar with, Who Cares Scotland? and the kind of work that the Funding Council does. You hear a lot of what it does in terms of funding, universities and colleges, but particular projects like that, looking after, supporting an organisation that supports young people who've been in care. I mean, I was horrified to discover that you had much higher chance of going to prison than you have of going on to further higher education, or that the numbers, when we talk about 50% going to university, the numbers for people in care was only 5%. Absolutely shocking statistics. So to do something and support them, as I tried to and have continued to do, I'm proud to do things like that. But I think some of the proudest moments were where you got big changes through the Ombudsman's office of making changes where, and it usually was cases where there had been deaths through one cause or another, making changes to public policy where hopefully the same thing wouldn't happen to others, but also to give some closure to parents who had gone through such a horrendous experience.
Thank you very much, Professor Alice Brown, Chancellor of Abertay University. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And can I just say thank you for coming? And I was a wee bit worried about this. I thought, oh, is Jackie going to be a bit like Paxman? It was an enjoyable experience. Thank you.